We're going to look at an introduction to Gen Z, and if I turn this on, it'll work. This morning we're looking at an introduction to Generation Z. How many of you have heard of the millennials? The generation everybody loves to hate, right? Okay, so Gen Z is the one after that. All right, we're going to be talking about Generation Z this morning. This morning is going to be part 2. Because everybody loves a prequel, all right? And so this morning is part 2, and tonight will be part 1, because this morning is much more introspective and much more kind of analytic of Generation Z, and our Generation Z is not here. So we can talk about them all we want, and there are no issues, right? So it's not a problem. But tonight will be more fun, more intergenerational. We'll be talking about some of you a little bit. So that will be tonight. So that's why we're doing part 2 this morning. This was kind of birthed from an hour and a half study I did, and so we're breaking it up. I'm not making you sit for an hour and a half. So just to give you an idea of where this information came from, if my clicker, well, there it is. So here are the materials that I used for this study. Generation Z, A Century in the Making, and it takes about that long to read this book. If you like textbooks and no pictures, no pop-ups, then this is the one you want. If you want something that's a little more interesting, but still pretty heavy, and man, my clicker is just not doing it this morning. Work. Okay. Is it working up there? No. It's happening in Oz. Well, there it is. Okay. This is, all right, now it's going crazy. Okay, so this is the one that would probably be more fun to read. If you like stats and pictures, and I pushed the wrong button. If you like stats and pictures and charts and diagrams, then this is your book to read from the Barna Group. But Meet Gen Z, if you're going to read just one, I would recommend reading Meet Generation Z. So that's where this information comes from. It is not my own, and now I'm not plagiarizing. All right. Let's move on. So Generation Z, what is Generation Z? Why are we even studying generations? They're studied because of marketing, political stuff. There's a lot of different reasons why we study have generational studies. And so political trends, education, healthcare, religion, workforce. All these areas are already talked about in Generation Z and have game plans in place for Generation Z already. So that's already happening, because right now the oldest of Generation Z are in their mid-20s and they're already in the workforce, and those who are preparing for this generation have already started talking about them, and so that's why. But the Bible talked a lot about generations before. Probably one of the saddest verses in the Bible, Judges chapter 2 verse 10, all that generation also were gathered to their fathers, talking about the generation with Joshua and Caleb. All that generation that grew up under Joshua, they were gathered to their fathers, they died, right? And then what happened? Another generation that, right, did not know the Lord, nor yet work with what he had done for Israel. So that. And then Deuteronomy chapter 6, if everything goes well in a perfect society, we teach generation to generation how to grow up, how to worship God, how to work with Him, and when generation to generation should pass that on, if everything's working correctly. Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 7 is that passage that says this is how it should pass on. The Old Testament is not the only place to find this information. We see this also in Titus. Older men, older women, young women, everybody's teaching the next generation coming up. So the Bible talks a lot about being introspective and looking into what's going on with the next generation. And we need to be those that teach the next generation. So that's why we can talk about it in Bible class. So now we're authorized, all right? So now we're looking at Generation Z. Those that are born 95 to 2010, 9 to 24 years old, mid-20s. First of all, I want to say that there is a lot of debate about generations and where you stop generations and where you start them, all right? Tons of debate, okay? So this could be moved around between 3 to 4 years, okay? So there's some swing time there. And we'll talk more about that tonight with our class. But there's a lot of debate about actual date range. But that's, in general, kind of where we are. 95 is the earliest for Gen Z. and some go as late as 2016. So there's some wiggle room there if you want to look at that. So they've been called iGen, digital natives. They called themselves the founders. MTV polled the Gen Z and asked, what do you want to be called? They wanted to be called the founders because they're starting things. They're very entrepreneurial, and we'll talk about more of that, I guess, tonight in talking about their studies. Why Homeland Generation? Any idea about Homeland Generation? What have they always grown up? When they travel, what have they always done? Please raise your hands. So they have always known that kind of travel. They've always known homeland security type situation. They've always known that. And they've never been before, right? And the only reference, maybe if they've seen the airplane movie, they might reference how it used to be, right? So they've never known like that kind of transportation. And they've never had life without homeland security. So post-millennials, the plurals, these are all the different names that they've been talking about. But why are we talking about them? Because they're a huge group. They're a huge group. Boomers thought they were all that in a bag of chips, but they are no longer the biggest generation. Millennials were bigger than them, and now Gen Z is even bigger than millennials. So it's a huge, huge population. And us Gen Xers are this kind of little group there. Nothing too fancy about us. So, but by 2020, they will constitute 40% of all consumers. Do you think Amazon studied Gen Z? Yes, they have, right? So all those who are selling anything have studied this generation because we're looking at a huge population boom. But it's also talked about, or possibly the last generation we'll ever talk about. The last generation, let's just think about that for a second. When we talk about generations, there are huge events that typically mark a generation. It isn't always every 20 years we'll talk about a generation. It isn't always that. But what they're saying is things are happening so quickly, technology is moving along so quickly that there won't be any really defining marks for a generation. We won't really talk about a specific nailed down generation in the future, a possibility, a hypothesis. But things are moving much more quickly than they used to. Whereas before we could mark a generation with radio to TV to computer, now it's just, technology is taking off, and it's not as easily marked that way. So possibly the only next generation we'll talk about, but time will tell. So we'll see how that goes. By the way, this is a class. So if you have questions, please raise your hand. I can't promise I'll have answers, but we'll try, right? So, so this morning, as I said, we're going to be more introspective. So we can talk about things that might be totes awkward for them to hear, okay? So that's why we're talking about that this morning. As far as self-perceptions, this is huge, a huge marker for Generation Z. 43% see personal achievement, and 42% see hobbies as the most important to their self, to who they are. So if you want to communicate, yes, sir? Oh, they'll be here tonight. We'll get them right between the eyes tonight. But I really want to talk about them while they're not here, because we have a responsibility to them, right? And we need to kind of know some things about them and be aware of some things. And we'll get to something this morning that's going to be pivotal for all of us to be in the know about, to help this generation coming up. But it's important to know these things. Only 1 in 3 see family background and religion as an identifier. This is just Gen Z in general, right? This is broad brushstrokes. This is not religious or non-religious, all right? We'll get to that in a second. But in general, they don't see family background, right? The 23andMe and all those online sites, and if you did all your research on your family history and you sat down and took an hour to explain to a young child their family background, guess what? They might not care, okay? So that is not a huge identifier for them. But more than half see their parents as role models. That is awesome and scary, right? Now again, this is a young generation, right? We're pulling a young generation. So they're gonna talk about those people that have the most influence in their lives. So kind of take some of this with a grain of salt. They're not mature. They have not necessarily seen all there is in the world yet. But for right now, they see their parents as role models. So that is important. If you're taking notes, I would write that one down. That's an important one for Gen Z. Those with different ethnic backgrounds see those identifiers. Obviously, that should be important. But here's what I want you to notice. Those engaged Christians see their faith as something to identify with. By engaged Christians, those are those who come to worship. Their family makes worshiping God a priority, makes the Bible a priority in their life, and lives by those ideals. That's an engaged Christian family. And when that is a factor in Gen Z's life, then it changes things very differently. Their views on a lot of things are very different. So that is a key factor in how they think and how they're shaping their ideas. That plays a big part in their sexuality and gender. Is this talked about at all? Sexuality and gender? I remember back when I was young, and a preacher used to say sex in a sermon, and it was scandalous, right? And now it's like, whatever, we say that as much as we say the Holy Spirit. So it's just very, very different. But sexuality is central to their sense of personal identity. Why? Why would you think that? They got to decide which one they are. Yeah. Homosexuality is a big topic. Sexuality in general is a huge topic. It's something that's talked about a lot of ideas floating around out there about it. So it is something that will be close to their identity. And it should, obviously. 48% believe gender is based on what a person is born, while 33% believe it has to do with how they feel. So less than half say it has to do with what you're born with, and more than a third, it's more about how you feel. And I would suggest that maybe that's a growing number, probably. And 7 out of 10 feel it's definitely or probably acceptable to be born one gender and feel like another. Now, there's a lot there that we can unpack. 70% feel that it's probably or is acceptable by society, acceptable to be born one gender and Shania Twain it to another gender. All right? You can feel like however you want to feel. So 70% think that's acceptable or plausible. Again, are we talking about this a lot? Are they hearing about this? Yes, they are. Yes, sir. Yes, sir, we'll get into that. That's right. So there's some different ideas about that. 3 in 10, 30% report knowing a friend or peer who has changed their sexual identity. How was that for you when you were growing up? Was that even talked about when you were growing up? Yeah. So there's a little bit different ideas about that. 45% would feel neutral if their friend was questioning their sexuality. 45% would feel, meh, whatevs. If somebody was questioning it, not a big deal, right? As big a deal if they had Cheerios or Pop-Tarts for breakfast, not a big deal, okay? Just, again, this is broad brushstrokes. Also, just a disclaimer here. We're talking about generalities and big, broad brushstrokes kind of concepts here. Once we get through this information, it does not mean that I know how everybody thinks on this subject. You can't come up to somebody who's in Gen Z and say, you have got to get your act together, right? Because they may not believe, and we'll see more and more as Christ and church families an influence on them, they don't believe this kind of stuff. This is Gen Z, grand, everybody, all right? We'll get to some numbers that shows the difference between those who are members of the church or practicing active people of the church compared to those who are not in just a moment. But this is for right now, everybody, okay? So be careful with the information. So as we look at more of these kind of ideas, and I get my pages here, goals and priorities. What motivates Gen Z? Teachers out there, it might not be scratch and sniff stickers like it was for us, right? It might not be working. Less likely to want to drive. more than 25% of seniors in high school do not have their driver's license. Which, when I read this, blew my mind, right? I was like, what in the world? I'm coming from the generation that as soon as I could, I was wanting to drive, right? There's a certain child in my life that I kind of had to like push. It's like, let's do this, man, all right? So I need you to do this. So yes, there's a less drive nowadays. So there are people who are graduating from high school going to college, and they don't know how to drive. It doesn't even matter automatic or manual. They don't know how to drive. So anyway, we'll get off that. But 41% are looking forward to the freedoms and responsibilities of adulthood. Less than half care about adulthood, right? Less than half care about those responsibilities. Which means what? Yes. All right. Yes. So boomerang children, and how long can a child stay on your insurance? Yeah, depending on your insurance, right? When I was growing up, man, get your own insurance. About that time. And so it's very different. And even the economy is kind of moving towards allowing things to, insurance has changed so that children can stay on longer with their parents. So it's not that society is saying we shouldn't do this. Society is helping this happen, right? Anyway, so that's that. There's a higher priority on career, education, and less focus on marriage and family. Career focused. And we'll talk more about why tonight, but some of that has to do with what they've seen their parents go through. Millennials, Gen Xers, and millennials had to change jobs 7 to 10 times. Whereas earlier boomers and those before were married to a job. Like, you didn't change. So if they're seeing their parents go from job to job to job, struggle with economics, 2007 started one of the greatest recessions since before World War II, and they saw their parents go through that, then that's why they're like, I'm focusing on taking care of myself because I've seen my parents struggle, and I don't want that. And that's why founders, and that's why we're going to be entrepreneurs, and that's why, so there's a lot of how that kind of cascades into other things. So of those who are engaged Christians, 46% say spiritual maturity is a goal compared to the unchurched, which it's kind of normal, right? But that's still less than half of those who are engaged Christians. Still less than half say that spiritual maturity is a goal. Engaged Christians, only 29% want to be married before they're 30. So if you're waiting on grandchildren, you're going to be waiting a while, all right? So that's what we're looking at right now. And only 16% want to have grandchildren. So the age of having a quiver full, you might get 2 shots, so you want to have a good aim, all right? So, and most of Gen Z cite parents or family members as role models, but 6 out of the 10 reasons why they cite them as role models is because of financial reasons, career and financial reasons. So again, we're starting to see that's a focus for them. All right, here's one that might be kind of spicy. Morality and values. Wheel of morality, spin, turn, turn, turn. Okay. Two of you guys over here know what I'm talking about. All right. So 24% believe that morality changes with culture. That's a growing number, by the way. That is not, and some of you in here probably believe that as well, but that is a growing number. 21% believe it depends on the individual. 34% of unchurched, while 77% of engaged Christians believe lying is morally wrong. 34% of unchurched people, unchurched Gen Zs, believe lying is morally wrong. That means how many? 2/3, essentially. Let's break that down because math in the morning. 2/3 believe lying is not a moral issue. So you can't trust them, right? No, you can't go around thinking that. But again, this is broad brushstrokes. But even 77%, so that's just only 2/3 of those who are engaged Christians believe lying is morally wrong. So here's where we're kind of separating some things out. I want you to pay attention to these numbers because we're going to have a question here at the end. 29% of unchurched, while 80% of engaged Christians believe abortion is wrong. Also a changing number. All these numbers are in flux as they continue to grow up and culture change to drive what is known as truth. 38% of unchurched, while 91% of engaged Christians view marriage as a lifelong commitment. We've had a lesson in here about just the eroding of marriage, and we see that, but I'll get to that question in a second. 21% of unchurched, while 76% of engaged Christians believe sex before marriage is morally wrong. That's, again, a changing marriage, changing marriage, but also changing number. 20% of unchurched, while 77% of engaged Christians believe homosexuality is morally wrong. So that's changing. What are we seeing with these numbers? Are they really close? No, they're like this, and they're going like this. Okay, so this polarity is getting much bigger. What did we say America was back when we waved the red, white, and blue, and back when we fought for what was right, and back when everybody knew your name? What did we believe America was? Morally, we were a what nation? Christian nation. Are we that way anymore, according to these numbers? No, we're not. No, we are not. If you really want an idea of where we're going as a nation, just look to Europe. That's where we're going, morality-wise. Look to their policies and their kind of change. That's where we're going. If you want an idea. We fought to get away from them, and now we just want to be like them. So, can't please anybody. So, why is this important to know? Why is this important to know? What does this mean as far as, now what responsibility do we have to Gen Z? Teach. Prepare for battle. Arm thyself, right? So that's what we need to be doing, because it is, they're not getting it out there, right? If we're saying, well, they have good friends, air quotes, right? They have good families, but look at what those good families are thinking. They are fine. They're great people. They get along with everybody. They're tolerant. And we have a good time when we're hanging out with those people. But those people aren't teaching the values that these people would believe and teach. So please understand that while, yes, we can have friends from outside, but those who speak into our lives and should have an influence should be here, should be in this room, right? So please make sure that that's happening for our children and grandchildren. Yes? Yeah. That's very good. The question was, is this generational or is this environmental as far as these numbers are concerned? Is that correct? So that's a very good question. So yes. So in some ways, these things are up on the screen are in some ways, again, I'm going to use a big, broad brushstroke answer here, are in some ways our fault. And we'll see that tonight. That's what we'll talk about tonight. Because we're going to go from generation to generation and see those changes, those things we made, those changes we made, and from generation to generation, how we are making things better, and now we're reaping what we sowed. All right, so that was part of it. It is that. But it is also kind of how we're looking at things. Because the thinking processes are different, we're looking at this next one talking about, we'll get to truth. When that gets eroded, then everything becomes this kind of postmodern, we're kind of in a postmodern kind of scenario. And so that erodes everything as well. So it's kind of burning a candle at each end. Does that answer your question? Yes. Yes. Yep. Yes. 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 Did you all hear that? Okay, so it's not what Michelle's saying is it's not fair to say. I guess fair is the right word. Can I use that word? She didn't use that word. It's not accurate maybe to say that because they fall in this generational gap that they're going to fall all of these generational markers. It is possible to take a child from any generation and raise them to be anything essentially. You can program a child to be anything. And that is exactly the point I'm trying to make. And we can close up class and go home at this point. So that is exactly what I'm trying to. It is so important that while we are in a generation and that thinks this way, one, we need to know how they think, because we need to be able to talk to them. Because this isn't just us protecting us. This is also us ministering to everybody else, right? So if we're just doing this, then we can just build a big commune and live inside of it, and we'll raise our children inside a commune, and they'll be exactly what we want them to be, barring a few little, everybody has a black sheep, right? So, but then we could also take this information and realize that this is us working talking into people's lives, being an influence on other people's lives. I need to know what makes them tick, how they think, how they view things, so I can talk to them. So it's double-edged here, this information. We need to protect, but we also need to look outward and be inclusive with this information. So that is exactly right, and that's exactly the point I wanted to make with this question we just talked about. So thank you very much for bringing that up. Yes, sir. Yep. 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 The Word of God should guide us, right? And there will always be those that are departing from the faith. If you want to talk about morality, Rome wasn't exactly a huge moral example, right? Not a shining star of morality, Rome and those early cultures. So we kind of, in some ways, turn the wheel around, but in some ways we're kind of digressing. So if you look at this next idea of truth, yes, sir. Mm-hmm.
Historically, I can go back and see this nation wasn't so great. This was a nation of hate at one point in time. And some people here grew up in a generation where segregation was the norm.
Mm-hmm.
So when we look at this generation, who they integrate so well together, and they don't have the issue of that baby boom generation where people were okay with lynching.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, going to people's homes and committing those type of social acts. That was a very moral generation.
No.
So when we look at morality, it's like almost subjective.
Yep.
Versus what would God say?
Yep. No.
If God said this is wrong, so morality in this country has always been in a state of flux.
No, yeah, no, and that's true with any group of people, anytime, anywhere, right? That is always a truth. That yes, there are some standards that should be in place, but there are always people who are not. And while there were people who did in the time believe in lynchings and that kind of stuff, there were people who didn't, and were persecuted for it. And that's a great.
We're not prosecuted for lynching in America. It's a historical truth.
Oh, I recognize that. And you're setting this thing up very perfectly for tonight. We're going to talk about that stuff tonight. If you want to be here for that, talking about how this generation is much more integrated than any other generation before. And so while we are talking about some morality things and how some dark corners of maybe, again, broad brushstrokes this generation, there are some really good shining areas for this generation. And again, not saying that this nation has ever been perfect. Raise your hand if you personally are perfect. Nobody is. Collectively as a nation, worse, right? So, and then as a nation, there are always things that are bad and wrong. And but again, broad brushstrokes here about these kind of things. Yes, ma'am.
I appreciate this lesson though, because what it's telling me is that my approach for teaching the gospel needs to be different than what it was in the past.
Yes, Jewel Miller film strips aren't going to work. And we'll talk about some things that we need to get, if we have time to get to it. Hopefully we do. But looking at truth, 37% of Gen Z believe it's impossible to know if God's real. 58% of teens and 68% of adults say there's no one true religion. 66% believe that a person can be wrong about something they sincerely believe, but that's down from 85%. That number's dropping. So what does that mean? What does that mean? There's a growing number of people that just because I believe it, it's true. Have you talked to somebody like that before? Well, I believe it. It's got to be truth. Well, can you support it? Well, that doesn't matter. That's irrelevant. That's irrelevant. I don't have to support it necessarily. I just have to believe it and be able to argue about it and make catchy memes about it. And now it's a fact. So 46% say that the need for factual evidence to support beliefs, which means less than half need factual evidence to support something. Let's break this down. Let me just put this other up here. Let's break this down. Right now, as a generation, would you say that we have greater access to information than any other generation or any other time before? But we have a group of people and that I don't really necessarily have to have facts. I can just print stuff out there and say this is true. I can, WikiLeaks this stuff and it's going to be fact. Which has birthed what? How many of you ever heard of Snopes? Those fact-checking engines, and they're not always accurate. They have agendas too. But you see, how many of you have posted something and somebody texted you or messaged you or talked to you later and said that wasn't accurate? Like you posted it as like, this is fact, I can't believe it. And then later on, somebody said that's probably not accurate. You might want to actually check that. Have you done that? Anybody? Okay. So that is happening more and more. And so when we see that, the problem that Gen Z and a lot of us have is how do we balance what science says and then what I learn on Sunday mornings with flannel graph? How do I balance that? What would your answer be? I feel like I'm singing an invitation song. What would your answer be if a child asks you, I'm learning this in science, but the Bible says this over here? All right, trust the Bible. But who made science? Yes, who said it first? God did, right? God made science. All right. Science, if it's honest, dovetails with the Bible. All right? Science, when it is honest, dovetails with the Bible. That's also true with the Bible. If you're honest with biblical information and you're not cray-cray with Bible information, it dovetails with science. All right? What do we have here in this congregation, and what do we promote quite a bit to help children understand that this happens? Apologetics Press. We have a tool here to help us with that. Should we be brushing up on those articles, even though there might have some big words that I'll have to increase my vocabulary? Yes, we probably should. To see that these things match. To understand that a carbon dating system is a broken system. And to understand that the Stone Age, Iron Age, Bronze Age, all kinds of stuff, that's a broken system. That is not accurate. All right? Those are all things that are not accurate. Yes, sir?
Kids of this generation, or whatever generation is coming after, they need to see the hard evidence that has been presented in Apologetics Press and other scientists, other scientific groups that prove what the Bible has to say about creation.
Yeah.
About how the world works.
Yes, there are other voices out there other than what they're learning in their textbooks in schools to get information from. Yes, sir?
I think it's funny in a lot of the scientific type shows that are on television. Like I was watching one the other day, and it was trying to talk about the origination of the universe.
Mm-hmm.
And so the guy says, well, once you can get by the fact that something came from nothing,
Yeah.
what happened?
Yeah. Let's skip over this, right? This big, huge detail of something came from nothing. Like Bill Nye, the not-so-science guy, who is really an actor, has no scientific degree whatsoever. How many of you were raised up watching that, okay? And maybe promoted that, the not-so-science guy. He is now so many memes. Look up some Bill Nye memes, and they're awesome. So truth. Well, what do we say about church? Among churchgoers, and that's one time in the last month, 82% say that it's a place to find answers. Great, I only have to come once a month and we're good. Probably not, right? But that's what this study identifies churchgoers as one time a month. It's relevant to their lives, again, among churchgoers. The sense of community is important. What do we try to emphasize here so much? That aspect, right? Family. We are a family, a sense of community, a sense of belonging. We have a bunch of crazy uncles and aunts here, so this is a great place. Only 35% believe traditional coat and tie is important, so we may want to rethink that. Among all Gen Z, 59% say church is not relevant. Among all, not relevant. It's not doing it for me, right? So, those that do come want to belong. Again, irrelevance is a word that's used a lot in relationship to church, faith, and truth. And what are we doing, and this is a question I'd like to ask as well, what are we doing to put some grit and spiritual resilience into our children? Yes, sir.
I can just sit here and not just think about if we're not aggressive. this is where our kids are, where our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren will be. If we're not aggressively changing and creating that environment, we just sort of neutral. We sort of bring them to church every now and then.
Yeah.
These are the values. They are Generation Z.
Yes, if we're neutral, I mean, think of a sponge, right? How many of you use sponges still? Anybody? Okay. So a sponge, like when you squeeze it in, and you put it into any kind of media, water, anything, and you let go of it, it soaks up whatever's there, right? So if we take our children and they're a sponge and you compact them, as they grow up, they're expanding. Whatever media they're around, whatever medium, whatever anything they're around, they're soaking up. So what do you want to be around them as much as possible that they're soaking up? God, right? That's a good Sunday school answer. God, Jesus, and the Bible, right? Those three things are the ones I want around my child, grandchild to be soaking up as much as possible as they grow up. Because if it's not, then they're soaking up something, right? They're soaking up something. Also, we need to, and tonight we'll talk more about this, how they view and how they talk about information and how they view others is very different than how we might approach a conversation. The style of being combative and debative is gone, dead. All right, they do not believe that is a way of talking with anybody. So much so that they're afraid to even share truth with somebody or what they believe to be true because they don't want to be viewed as judgy. I don't want to be judgy. I mean, even some children close to me will say, well, I don't want to be judgy, but, all right, so, I mean, they recognize that that's an issue, but they're still going to say it. So we need to make sure that we're not just giving them information, but we're teaching them how to use it as well. Because, again, information can be two-edged. Passing on faith, hopefully we'll have time. Again, this is kind of what I was just talking about. What is scientism? Because science says it's so, right? If you wave a banner that says, because science, right? That's scientism. And so how do I argue truth? How do I talk to people about faith when scientism is the law of the land? And so those are things we need to be working with the Gen Z and to teach them so they're not viewed as to talk with people, an open dialogue that's not combative. They need to have reasons for faith. Teaching apologetics for Gen Z is not an option. If you're wavering, well, I'm not sure if we should do this. Yes, do it, right? It is not an option. This needs to be something that they read and know about. And when you raise them up on the biblical worldview, not just coloring books in the pew. We need to take their faith seriously. When they're in here, they're soaking up something, right? We need to take from this age up seriously. Cradle Roll knows what a Bible is when you hold it up, because they've been taught to know what a Bible is when you hold it up. Are you sure? Okay, so it's important that we raise children up in these things. Very quickly, they need wise relationships with parents and others. They need to be shown how to create healthy spiritual habits. Yes, sir.
Previous slide, Josh, saying that the generation feels that the church is not relevant.
Yep.
That's a slap at us in that we're the church. But what they're saying is they're not seeing anything in the church that's relevant to them.
Yes.
That's supposed to be our role.
Yep. And again, that's Generation Z at large. That is not this generation. That is at large generation. But yes, that you're right. It is kind of saying to us, you don't really matter. Like you're not important in my worldview of things. It's kind of what that's saying.
So what I'm saying is that our impression, and I understand that you're talking about the church in general, blah, 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 but the reality of it is, if you are Christ, you are going to be relevant in somebody's life.
Yes. Yep. I think I've read that somewhere. They will know you by your love. Something like that. I can't remember. So there's a lot of, again, like so much here we can't get into, but if we apply biblical principles, those biblical principles are true for any generation, any time, anywhere, any place, any language, any culture. And that's one of them that you're talking about. Important topics for Gen Z. Let me just put these up here. These are things that should be talked about in the home. Emptiness. All of these things are important topics. We don't have a lot of time to dive into all of these things, but they are the most diverse generation ever, and that should be something that's praised. And we'll talk more about some of the numbers with that. How to handle technology, how to handle money, what sex is, what truth is, how to empathize with people correctly. Empathize or tolerance isn't just agreeing with everything they're saying necessarily. Openness about who they are and faith, and then emptiness. We'll talk about some of these stats tonight. That while teen pregnancy and teen drug use is down, the issues, psychological issues with depression, suicide is on skyrocketing. So the ones, sex, drugs, and rock and roll, not an issue, right? Well, I mean, it's always going to be an issue, but it's not as big an issue as some of the other things that the psychological side of, mental side of handling, living in this life, but not getting scarred by that. So we'll talk about some of that tonight. Any questions, comments before we close? Yes, sir.
It may be oversimplified, but I think you said the cradle roll, they know what a Bible is physically.
Yeah.
But for people to know that the Bible is God's Word and rely on it, that would solve all this.
That's why I got 12 more years with them, right? So, but yeah, that's exactly right. Right, so we got to start somewhere, and we need to make sure they know exactly right what the Word of God is. Thank you very much for your time this morning.